Hello, and welcome to Teaching with Tara podcast number 1, where I'm joined by my fabulous fiance, Mr. Ryan Posadni. So, a little bit about myself. I am a special education teacher in 4th grade ICOT classroom at School 58 in Rochester City School District. This is my 7th year teaching, and I am currently going to school at Brockport College for my master's in literacy, where I'm taking 2 classes this semester, one of them being my EDI 728 class, which is called Critical Literacy Birth through 12th course. And one of the final project options was to record a podcast, which is why we are here today. So I'm going to pass the mic to my fiance so he can introduce himself and tell my professor a little bit more about him.
Awesome. Great introduction. My name's Ryan Posadni, as Ms. Topolski said. Born and raised Rochester, so I'm very happy to see the great crop of teachers we have learning and bettering themselves to raise the youth of my great city. A little bit about myself. I got my undergrad at the University of Niagara, where I met Ms. Topolski, and my MBA focused in supply chain from the Rochester Institute of Technology. I currently work for L3 Harris, doing subcontracts for their team in procurement. But I'm very passionate about enabling our teachers to have the tools and resources to help the next generation and not, leave them to figure it out on their own. So I'm very excited to talk about topics to make, the children of our community more educated and ready to make a difference in our community.
Thank you. I know we talk about literacy all the time, so this is nothing new for you. So my professor, Dr. Cody Miller, is asking us to summarize everything we have learned so far around critical literacy. So today's podcast is going to be centered around critical thinking and critical literacy in the classroom. So first, I wanted to start by giving you a little bit of background knowledge of how critical literacy is defined. And I have to include 14 references. So I will be citing some of our course articles and videos and texts as we speak, okay?
That's great, because I need a little bit more of a background. I didn't get to take the class, so I didn't get the full background you got on the topic. So I'd love to hear what you learned this year so I can have a good conversation here.
Okay, awesome. So my first reference is from Paulo Freire. I hope I said his name right, as cited in the Roots Connected article that states that critical literacy is not a teaching method, but a way of thinking and a way of being that challenges texts and life as we know it. So Paulo was an educator and philosopher and lead advocate of critical literacy from Brazil. And many of our course readings were influenced by his work that he did. So another quote from Freire states that critical literacy focuses on issues of power and promotes reflection, transformation, and action. And it encourages readers to be active participants in the reading process, to question, dispute, and to examine power relations. So to me, critical literacy is not like a curriculum that teachers are handed, but rather it's like a lens through which they teach. So we want to encourage kids to think of their own ideas around texts and to make sure that they're thinking critically about what they're reading about. So when you hear the term critical literacy, what comes to your mind, or what do you already know about it?
Sure. So just at face value, I want to make sure I'm understanding the actual idea of critical literacy, not just for myself, but I guess for our audience. Based on, the quotes you cited briefly above, critical literacy is truly being critical of the source of what we're reading and not taking it as a fact, and understanding the perspective the author might be coming from or a view they're trying to get across. Would you say that's kind of fair?
Yeah, that's exactly it. Yep.
Okay. So going off of that, I think it's great to teach kids that not everything they read is true.
Mm-hmm.
Back when we were younger, we would read a book or a magazine article. If we were reading a book, for the most part, books are very well cited, very well researched, and meant to be 100% educational.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that comes down kind of to the commercialism of the book. When you buy a book or rent a book, you have made the purchase. The person is no longer really trying to sell you that book, so they want to present you with facts. I think that's very different than how kids read today.
Yeah.
Even what I've seen with my nieces and nephews, they read on the internet. They read Facebook posts, TikTok, Instagram.
and they're not able to identify the author of what they're reading sometimes. They might think they're watching a makeup video where a woman is putting on makeup because she likes it, and presenting it as a fact that this skin cream makes wrinkles go away,
right.
and the author's really presenting that as a fact,
right.
Whereas if you kind of look into the post, she's actually trying to sell you that product because she's sponsored. It's actually a commercial.
Yeah.
It's not an article based on research or facts. So I think the idea of critical literacy, especially for our children, and the earlier you can instill it, is to not tell people they're wrong, but try and gather your own background, your own facts about the author and the viewpoint they're coming from, to understand what they're actually trying to get across, and then kind of vetting your own information. I think, as a fourth grader like you teach, they might not understand, some things are commercials. If they see a commercial for a toy, they're like, this is the coolest toy ever.
Right.
They don't realize $1 million in advertising revenue just went into that commercial to get their parents to buy it for them.
Right.
So helping kids to understand that not everything they read or see or hear is coming from pure intentions. It might be truly to sell you on a product, or even sell you on an idea,
right.
Whether it's like a political ad or something. Just being critical of sources, I think, is something that's important to teach our kids, because until someone makes you aware of that,
right.
you don't know to be critical of things. You would have no reason to, not believe somebody or not, trust them until somebody kind of points these things out to you.
Right.
So I guess, sorry to ramble on a little bit, but I think that's what critical literacy is to me. And I, just based on your brief introduction, I think it's pretty important to, explain to kids, or even adults our age. I think our parents could use some of that, really understanding, you have to be critical, you have to be skeptical sometimes.
Right.
You can't take everything just as a fact immediately.
Right. And I love how you brought in media and like social media and technology, because we are definitely going to talk about that today. That's called multimodal text.
Perfect.
Okay.
Yeah, we can get into that for sure.
And another idea that you said was, it's good to start early on, because I think before I took this class, I always thought of critical literacy being taught only in high school and secondary classrooms. But I think it is really important to build these skills earlier on, which brings me to our next topic of how it can be applied in the classroom. And for me, you already mentioned I teach in fourth grade. So fourth grade is technically still elementary. So how can we build in these skills early as, 5, 6 years of age, and build those until they get to college? So I want to reference a quote here from an article titled Critical Literacy, Children as Changemakers in Their Worlds, where they stated that teachers should choose texts that are meaningful and raise important topics or issues. So I know you've heard me talk about texts as windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors. That term was that term was coined by Rudine Bishop, and she said that children should have texts that they should see themselves in, and that they should be able to see other perspectives and views. So I kind of want to talk about our fourth grade social studies curriculum, which is all about the Haudenosaunee people. You know how we've been talking about in social studies, the Native Americans of New York State. Well, the next part of that unit is teaching the Europeans. And so one way we go into that unit is through the read aloud text called The Encounter. And The Encounter is a read aloud that we chose because it never actually states that they're white Europeans, but the text is told through the story and the perspective of the Native Americans and the arrival of the first Europeans. And so we taught this lesson just a week ago, and I love this text that we chose because it is a meaningful text that talks about a very serious and deep issue. And like, we talked about this all the time. Like, we were taught as kids that Christopher Columbus was a savior. And like, we literally sang songs about him and made different arts and crafts about him. And so now I think critical literacy is what really brought into what we teach now, which is the truth of the history and figuring out like the different perspectives of both the Native Americans and the Europeans. So I think when we taught the lesson, the students were so engaged with the text, and they were asking so many deep questions, and they referred to um, the the Europeans as the strangers, because that's who
Right.
who the Europeans were to the Native American people. They were strangers. So they so I think my next point is going into like the types of questions that we should be asking kids and modeling for them. And at such a young age, they're not always they can't always ask the questions, so we need to model those questions for them.
Right.
So what do you think?
No, I like how you brought up the Native American people, because before you started teaching that unit, I had been using the name
Iroquois to describe the Native Americans of New York. And you kind of introduced me to the word Haudenosaunee, which is their word, which is much more respectful, much more culturally appropriate. And it kind of brings me back to this idea that I've heard throughout my education in history classes, that history is written by the victors. Right, because that's typically the person coming in, taking over. That's who keeps their books. That's who spreads their family. That's who spreads their knowledge. So we kind of we lost a little bit of the knowledge of the Haudenosaunee people when the Europeans came over and started kind of conquering.
Can I jump in really
Of course,
quick?
go
Sorry.
ahead.
So we just visited the historical museum site of the Haudenosaunee and Victor called Ganondagan. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And we learned there that written language and written stories weren't a part of their culture.
Mm-hmm.
They spread stories through the word of mouth, which is orally. So we didn't have documentation of the Haudenosaunee, but through the written documents of the Europeans.
That gets even harder to carry on their tradition when we're displacing them, and unfortunately, some of their numbers aren't surviving, and they're getting spread out and running, and they're losing their history, which is pretty unfortunate.
Right.
Back to that idea that history is written by the winners. That's how me and you got books growing up about Christopher Columbus being this hero that conveniently left out the years and years of slaughter and abuse and torture. Right. So it's I think when we look at those kind of texts, it's a great example of critical literacy for your students. Is this book was most likely written by European descent American who was also told Christopher Columbus was a savior, and he discovered America and brought Europeanism to America, whereas a Native American child reading that book is easily able to use critical literacy because they know the author it's coming from, and they know that it's not truly what they believe. Right. Even when it comes down to some of these stories you've read to your kids this year about, some of the Haudenosaunee or, different tribes of Native Americans, some of their belief systems. If we're reading a book about the turtle god, they take that as a fact because it's coming from their elders, the people they believe. Whereas when they read the Bible, they're very critical of that. And vice versa. When we read the Bible, traditionally our families are like, yep, this is a fact. This is true. It's coming from a reputable source, not questioning anything. And then we hear a story about a turtle and the earth is on the turtle's back.
That's their creation story.
Exactly.
And to them, this is part of their spiritual beliefs, right?
Right. So I think that's part of critical literacy, where two very different authors are passing down two very different stories. And depending on your own background and your own beliefs, you take one as a fact and one is completely made up. But it happens on both sides. So, that's kind of it is critical literacy in a sense, I believe, because, we take some of these things as facts, but that same idea can also be applied and seen, whether we're talking about historical books about Christopher Columbus or vice versa, the Native Americans who were traumatized by him.
And I'm just going back to the text, The Encounter, and that story was a story written through the perspective of one of the Native American boys. But then looking at the written documentation of Christopher Columbus, we have his diary. I think it's good to show both perspectives, and that's critical literacy. So looking at the encounter as one of our texts that we chose, and then looking at Christopher Columbus's diary and looking at the perspective of the Europeans coming in, right?
Mhm.
And seeing both perspectives and like critical literacy is examining power relations too.
Right. You
So,
said that in the quote earlier.
so looking at like, okay, who has the power in the text, the encounter? Who's the power
Right.
source in Christopher Columbus's diary? So examining that power, looking at positioning, and that goes back to the types of questions that we're asking throughout the text. Like who created the text, who is the intended audience, and how is the author using the power in the text? And I think these questions are really important. But when you're talking with 8-year-olds and 9-year-olds,
Right.
you're going to have to like explicitly teach what is power, right? What is perspective? Because these are new words for them. But I think if they're hearing it throughout the grades as they continue to progress in their years at schooling, I think they're going to be able to build on those and like get into deeper conversations with power and perspective if they're introduced to them in early elementary grades.
So it might be easy for them to understand in these situations. Christopher Columbus has the power because, they can easily, tell they have more people, they have,
firearms, they have money, they have a food source. So it's kind of easy for them it might be easier for them to make those distinctions at this level.
Yeah.
But then it'll also help them carry the idea of critical literacy when they start getting into more complicated things like, in high school, they might start taking an interest in politics and understanding who in politics actually has power and why they're driving their decisions that way. So it's almost like critical literacy can be built upon and, keep evolving as the knowledge and ability to understand what they're reading and the sources grows with the student.
I mean, at the end of the day, we want our students to be able to leave their school. So like they graduate from high school and then they go to college, and then we're hoping that they become like active citizens in our community that are critical thinkers and don't, necessarily believe everything they see and read and think for themselves. And I think that's huge. Like we want our students thinking of their own ideas and seeing like they were all raised in different backgrounds and environments and homes with different past experiences that make them who they are. So we're looking at like, how can we teach our students to think critically beyond the words and pictures on the page? Like, how can we think of their own ideas and summarize the text?
Right. No, I think that's super important for, when you say trying to make active members in our community and our society. I think critical literacy is really important because if you're not educating yourself and questioning things, it's easy to believe whatever somebody's telling you. So like when your students graduate high school and go to college and, start voting, if you aren't critical of like political ads, you could think very easily, oh, this person says they're going to decrease poverty and they're going to lower taxes and they're going to do this, this, and this.
Right.
When if you're not skeptical or critical of that at all, it's very easy to, fall in love with somebody politically thinking they're going to do all these things, but not, taking a step deeper into how are they going to do this? Or is that even possible?
Right.
People unfortunately draw very firm stances and hard lines about their political beliefs because basically, he said he's going to do this, this, and this, and I believe him wholeheartedly.
Right.
Where, I think both politicians on either side, all politicians make some promises that they don't intend to keep or aren't, prepared or even, promises that aren't even possible to keep.
Right.
So being critical of things, it's almost like if it sounds too good to be true. If politician A says, I'm going to lower crime, lower taxes, lower this, lower that, make your life perfect, we have to be critical of that because that doesn't seem possible. If it was as easy as you're saying it is, why has nobody done that yet? So I think this idea of critical literacy, as we apply it to books and ideas and teachings, can be brought into many aspects of life. Right. And it's just a great tool for a student to have in their tool belt to apply to many facets of life and help them not get taken advantage of realistically.
Right. And speaking of like politicians and like ads, now we're seeing like more ads brought up in like the digital world. And so that brings us to our next point of technology. So And so our next topic is going to be kind of how critical literacy can be applied in our digital world, which is so important today. And so my professor is going to laugh when you tell him how I literally just started using critical literacy skills on social media.
At 30 years old.
So I watched this YouTube video helping students identify fake news with the 5 C's of critical consuming. And they did a study, you're probably going to believe this, where only 25% of students were able to identify accurate information online.
Mhm.
Isn't that like scary?
It is, but that people get paid a lot of money to trick you into thinking what their influencer or their politician says is true. That's careers.
Right. And I totally believe this because even at 30 years old, I still find myself believing everything I see, hear, and read online.
I see you doing
I know. And like looking at kids now who have phones at 9 years old, like I have fourth graders with phones. I would say half of my class has phones. I think that it's really important to teach critical literacy skills as it is applied in technology in our digital world and how to read and make sense of multimodal text.
Mhm.
That's the word.
Sure.
So I think that's really important. And I think also parents, families, and communities would like that too. Because I know you heard from me last year, we had a problem with technology in our crew, and then it was brought into the classroom. And so, I think it's really important that our students are given these critical thinking skills so that they're not like me and consume everything they see and hear online.
Right. So for our audience who doesn't know, I personally do not have any social media because I don't see the value in it. I see all the negatives that it can bring that significantly, in my opinion, outweigh some of the positive things that come from social media. Whereas our other host, Ms. Topolski here, uses TikTok and Instagram to,
entertain herself, but also get ideas for teaching or ideas for crafting or, some good ideas, but also is exposed to a ton of negativity and a ton of opinions, which I think is very hard for a lot of people to understand. This kind of rise of social media has happened so quickly that we haven't developed tools for a person to be able to decipher the information they're bringing in. It's still very hard for people to take in all this data.
Yeah.
I say data as in posts or messaging, take all of it in, but we don't have the tools and skill sets to, use critical literacy to decipher the information. To, it comes so fast at you, just add, post, add, post, that you don't have the time to properly be critical of what you're reading and disseminate that information. So a lot of time people take everything they see as fact just because there's so much more coming at them. They don't have the time to process it.
Right.
So like when I see you scrolling through TikTok and you get a TikTok of a girl talking about face cream. I brought this example up earlier.
Right.
And you're like, oh my gosh, this face cream will solve all the problems that I see in myself. It's very quick to not realize at the bottom of that post, she's being paid by that company to tell you all of this stuff.
Right.
So it's just dangerous. And, it's the same idea with politics. You can see somebody, completely degrading one political side to lift another, where, maybe they're getting bad information that they think is a fact.
Right.
It seems like nobody does their research anymore. And I think a great example we saw in the last few years is COVID.
Yeah.
Everybody I knew on social media immediately somehow had their doctorate degree in biology. Everybody I saw on social media was a doctor all of a sudden and knew everything about infectious diseases. And the misinformation on every side coming from every angle was just coming so fast. People didn't know who or what to believe. And I think that's so dangerous.
Yeah.
And critical literacy is great because you can stop and examine the source and what they're trying to say. But I think it's also really tricky on social media because there's just so much content and it's coming so fast. You can't do your proper due diligence to stop and analyze every post you see.
Right.
So I think that's just crazy to me how fast it comes in.
Right. And I know we've talked before about confirmation bias.
Oh, sure.
And that was mentioned in the video. How does fake news become real news? Because I know firsthand that the algorithm will literally surround my feed with stories and news that I already think or believe. And that's true for maybe the kids on social media reading those posts. So I know this is a crazy idea, but I do believe that during COVID, like you said, and the Black Lives Matter movement, there was so much violence during that
Right.
time. And when we think about it, the impact of misinformation and those online conspiracy theories literally, and a quote unquote, threatens our democracy, as told in the Learning for Justice article by Corey Collins. So we need to reimagine our digital literacy education. And I think he also says that schools and communities need to update and extend their commitment to digital literacy to address how information is spread and who it helps and who it harms. Because a lot of the times our students aren't educated on it, but not our teachers aren't educated on it. So if they're not educated on it, how are they going to be able to teach the kids and families about how misinformation is spread?
Sure.
So I think it needs to start holistically at the community level, so that we can really say, this is really important right now. We need to give teachers the resources and education around it so that we can help our students and families, because I think this is a really important topic that we need to talk about, because digital information is spread so quickly, so widely. So I think that's really important.
No, I completely agree. And I love that you brought up confirmation bias. A lot of people don't understand how the algorithms on their favorite social media work. It's been scientifically proven that negative news solicits more reaction than positive news, right? If you see a picture of a puppy, you're going to smile to yourself and keep scrolling. If you see a picture of something happening in Gaza, you're going to stop and comment and talk about how bad it is and draw more attention to something negative, right?
Right.
And unfortunately, that is how social media companies make money. It's by click or by viewership. So that algorithm is specifically designed to get you to stop what you're doing and be an active participant most of the time in negative things.
Right.
And I like that you brought up confirmation bias again, because that algorithm knows to keep putting things you already believe in front of you.
Right.
So you brought up Black Lives Matter in that movement. So if you were somebody who was completely against it, hated it, wanted nothing to do with it, or spoke out against it, and you would stop to watch something that agreed with your view on Facebook one time, that's all you would start seeing.
Right.
And it would just keep feeding that hate into you on either side, because that is how Facebook would make money off of you.
Right.
So it's really unfortunate that social media algorithms kind of directly compete against the idea of critical literacy. They don't want you to be critical and stop and think. They want you to keep going and consuming more and adding without thinking.
Right.
So it's just very scary to me, social media. It's almost the antithesis and the exact opposite of critical literacy.
Right.
They don't want you to be critical, and they definitely don't want you to read.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. But, I think there are some positives of multimodal literacy, including as a fourth grade teacher, I know a lot of my students are using multimodal literacy at home. So I think that it's really important to incorporate multimodal literacy in the classroom and using these platforms.
Right, I agree, because I do see the great ideas you get off of Pinterest or TikTok to bring into your classroom. And there is a lot of great stuff on there.
And it engages them too.
Right, because it almost becomes culturally relevant learning.
Right.
If TikTok dances are what kids are interested in,
right,
that gets them engaged in school and excited to come.
Right.
I've seen you remix a popular song on TikTok to get your kids singing about it was All My Life. What was it?
Summarizing.
Yeah. Now all your kids can sing me a song about summarizing because you made it relevant, through a song that was popular on social media that they all knew about. So there definitely are good aspects to it. I don't want to poo-poo it and make it sound awful and miserable, but it scares me is honestly why I don't like it.
So I don't know if you know this, but on TikTok, it's called Book Talk. And it's where I know our friend Ashley talks about this. So obviously the algorithm, if you're into books, if you research books or like a video or a post on books, you'll start seeing Book Talk, right? And so when you're on Book Talk, this is what I love about TikTok, because you'll see I would say call them influencers who have mini digital book clubs on TikTok and who are here are my top 5 December books for the month. And you're able to see those books and see their reviews and they're probably like, comment in the comments your favorite part of the book. Or so I think there are some like definitely positives of using multimodal literacy, and
Okay.
not only for kids but for adults too. So
No, that's great. And the idea of a book club is great because, you know, a traditional book club, you all read the book and then you talk about the themes, you talk about the author, you talk about, you know, the voice and the idea it's trying to get across, which is great. And that's really the idea of critical literacy. The book club almost is like the precursor to critical literacy, right? It's a group of people talking about the things and themes they got from it to, you know, shed light on something you might not have picked up on. So if there was a way for that idea to be incorporated into social media, that would be awesome. But I, you know, as someone kind of removed from it, I'm not sure how that works. But I do believe the idea of thinking about the author and where they're coming from and the idea or they're trying to get across is so important because, you know, you can start to examine their biases and why they're saying what they're saying, whether it's good or bad or indifferent, or you agree with it or disagree with it. It's important to know where it's coming from and why it's being said.
Right. Yeah. I think that's really important. I just had an idea. Oh, so my idea was like, obviously, like we don't have kids yet.
Right.
But like when we do have kids, I think we definitely will have a fear of like, what will they be exposed to on the internet, especially now. You know, I think kids are exposed to a lot more than what we had growing up. So I think that's definitely a fear. So I'm not saying I want all kids on social media right now being exposed to all this content, especially my 4th grade babies. But I wish, and I wonder if there's an app out there or something that's similar to TikTok, but only for educational purposes. So like maybe they can post, it's like all the same, like you can still post a video that you can choose to be, you know, 60 seconds, 15 seconds, you know, but they're sharing what they've learned and maybe a book that they've read in class, or like, you know, for the encounter, maybe they're doing their own, creating their own content on what they thought of the encounter, you know? So
no, that's a great idea. I'm just, you know, skeptical, Ryan. How do you get kids to want to do that as opposed to watching people dance for 15 seconds? You know,
maybe they can incorporate body movement.
No, it's a great idea.
So, okay. So I think the last topic that I want to talk to you about was an important topic to me because I'm excited about it. So in our last module of this course, we talked about how comic books can deepen students' understanding of critical literacy. So comic books and graphic novels. So I was just listening to a podcast about this because I think it's so interesting. And in the article, Elementary Students' Meaning Making of Graphic Novels, Pantaleo focused her study on how visual elements and art represented in graphic novels can deepen students' critical literacy skills. So like going back to the story of the encounter with the Native Americans and first Europeans, even my lowest students were able to make sense of the text and ask questions just by looking at the illustrations. And for my professor, my lowest students are currently reading at like a pre-K kindergarten levels, and they were engaged in the text. And this was a deeper meaning text that they had to make sense of. And they were using the illustrations on the page to really make sense of what was happening. And they were asking questions. So I think here's why I really love graphic novels. They can build the confidence of young readers, even if they don't necessarily think of themselves as readers. So like I come home and tell you all the time, I have students in the 4th grade who can't really decode long sentences, right? And they will tell us, they're like, I can't read that. And their confidence is just completely shot because they don't have it. So I think that if you're looking at graphic novels, they're pretty thick. So, and the text that my lowest kids are getting say like, the cat is in a box. And so when we're doing guided reading and the other kids are like looking at what we're doing and they're noticing that, of course, my students are also seeing that their peers are watching them read these 4-word texts, right? So I think if I put a graphic novel in front of those kids, that they're going to feel like, wow, I just read a thick book in 4th grade, just like my peers who are maybe on grade level, right? And so I think that graphic novels can offer a lot for critical literacy and just the overall confidence of young readers in schools.
No, I think that's great. I know yesterday you came home and you were talking about your small reading group, and you had a few kids come to the small reading group table and say immediately they don't know how to read, which is heartbreaking, for their confidence, because they're literally coming to the table
saying they can't read when, if you sit down, they can.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just their confidence is so shaken, which is heartbreaking. So I think graphic novels or comic books are great because it not only, do the pictures help them decode what's going on in the text, it's also something engaging to them.
Mm-hmm.
I remember in high school, if I had to read The Great Gatsby and it was something I had no interest in, it was hard for me to even read it.
Right.
I remember we had to read The Hobbit going into my freshman year of high school, and it just wasn't really something I was interested in.
Yeah.
And it's not like the words in the book were hard. It just wasn't engaging me at all.
Mm-hmm.
So finding those texts that can help a student be engaged and want to get better at reading.
Right.
If you're reading a story and they are riveted by what's going on, it's going to encourage them to sound out a word so they can keep progressing in that story,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is great. Another great topic about comic books, if you're going to let me be a nerd for a minute here, is it's easier to get in, some ideas that you want to, pass off and help people understand. One great example that I'm thinking of is the entire idea of the X-Men. The entire idea of the X-Men comics are immigrants and people of, disparaged communities, whether it's LBGT communities, communities. That's really what the entire idea of the X-Men was, and enabling them to have powers, let them become more accessible.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So the idea of mutants, there's, some storylines are they're immigrants and some are they're, some of these smaller communities. But that's the entire idea of what X-Men are. And by allowing students or younger readers to experience some of these different walks of life through a much more accessible medium allows them to become much more accepting.
Yep.
Right. So I think that's a great idea. But it's also a place to apply critical literacy,
right.
Looking at those stories and why is the storyteller telling this particular story? Maybe they were, of that community and wanted to, share some of their life stories. But that's also, even in comic books, you can apply critical literacy,
mm-hmm.
whether you're reading Mouse or V for Vendetta. Those are also coming from authors who have a message to get across.
Right.
So I think it's great. Or The Watchmen, is a great political kind of book where you get to use critical literacy to see exactly what they're trying to get across.
And a lot of those graphic novels and comic books actually have, like you said, those topics, like whether they're political or historical. And I think that's really important because you're looking at those topics critically.
Yep.
And looking at, again, going back to how we look at critical literacy through power, perspective, and looking at how the art in the graphic novel and the words show that perspective and power, I think is really important for students and engaging. And also going back to the windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors, I think graphic novels and comic books can offer a variety of diverse characters that students can connect with and see themselves in, especially now. Like, I'm just thinking about my fourth graders who go to library each week. Most of them, I would say a lot of them, come back with graphic novels because they're engaged in it and they see themselves in the text and they're able to make those connections. And I think if you find a book that students are engaged in, I think it will be easier to apply those critical thinking skills.
Right. It encourages them to want to get better at what they're doing. If you go to like high school sports, if you want to play varsity, it encourages you to get better at the sport you're playing so you can make that level. Yeah. It's the same idea with books. If you want to keep reading, the first Harry Potter book is a pretty, it's very easily accessible to younger readers. But by the time you get to the fifth, sixth book, they become a little more difficult to read. Yeah. But I think that encouraged our generation to become better readers. It's not quite critical literacy, but, it still encourages people to get better at reading, which I think can be parlayed into critical literacy.
Right. And I know you don't know this because you're not a teacher, but there are a lot of New York State standards that talk about how the illustrations and how the words on the pages are displayed, and how they connect with like the theme or the central
Sure.
message of the text. So when you're looking at graphic novels, you have to think critically of the text to make sense of
Sure.
it between the words and the pages and the sequential art that's in the
Yep.
page. And I cannot remember where I heard this from, but I did hear that graphic novels, I think the University of Oregon did a study,
Okay.
and they showed that graphic novels and comic books have deeper vocabulary and more like
I've heard this.
advanced vocabulary and words that are chosen because there's only a few words on the page.
Right.
So the authors pick and choose which words that they want to display on the page. And so the reader really has to make sense of those
Right.
unknown vocabulary words.
Yeah,
to
I
make
think
meaning.
that, ties hand in hand with what you're seeing on the page illustrated. If you're seeing, a big action sequence that's bright and colorful and flashy,
Mhm.
that author wants to use words that are bright and colorful and flashy. They
Mhm.
don't want to use good. They want to use, amazing, like the
Right.
Amazing Spider-Man. It's not the pretty good neighborhood Spider-Man,
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
the Amazing Spider-Man. So they're using, and again, I understand amazing's not the most in-depth vocabulary word,
Right.
but for a fourth grader,
Right.
it's got a lot of challenging sounds in it. It's got
Yeah.
Z's. Not every word they see every day has a Z in it. But and they also get to learn the ideas of alliteration. Like if you're talking about the Fantastic
Yes.
Four,
Yes.
there's so many themes in comic books that weigh heavily into literacy,
Mhm.
and it's just a very easily accessible way. And it's not all just throwaway lines and stories to melt your brain like your parents said they would, right? There are themes like in the X-Men that apply to life and can, develop your character as a person, not
Right.
just some basic form of entertainment to pass the time while you're grounded in your room, right? You actually learn something and carry it out.
Right.
And
I'm
can
gonna
bring it into your life.
put you on the spot here
Okay.
a little bit,
Go ahead.
because when we speak about critical literacy, we're also talking about like history and how history is
Sure.
presented. And you did say that you knew some comic books and graphic novels that presented historical topics.
Sure.
So do you know any that
I do. So I think one great example is a book called Maus, Maus, and I don't know the author off the top of my head, but it actually, I think it takes place in Germany,
Okay.
kind of World War II.
Okay.
But it makes some of those really harsh topics much more accessible to younger people. Obviously talking about World War II is very traumatic and very hard because it's
Yeah.
real life.
Right.
But when they start painting, Germany and Jews as cats and mice, it
Right.
becomes more accessible, and you can understand the themes as a child
Mhm.
through that lens,
That's so interesting.
as opposed to thinking of different cultures. It makes it a little more accessible. Another one that's also not really, Mouse is probably good for middle school, high school age kids. The Watchmen's a great graphic novel about politics and kind of nuclear war eventually.
Mhm.
But real life themes that become much more accessible
Yeah.
to younger readers, not young, but it just becomes more accessible through allegories and illustration, as opposed to reading a dry history book about how nuclear fission works.
Right. I think they have so much to offer in the classroom and can be used in a teacher's tool belt in a really meaningful way. I'm just thinking here that I need to make a donors choose on getting some graphic novels in my guided reading group so that
That'd be great.
we can
Because,
engage those babies.
again, you always hear don't judge a book by its cover, but when you're in fourth grade, if that cover's not cool,
Yeah.
you're not picking that book.
That's true.
Right. But if it's something engaging, and even if it's, like a historical nonfiction,
Yeah.
or a historical fiction,
Yeah.
Whether it's about Abe Lincoln killing vampires or something,
Yeah.
there's even still ideas that get children interested in it,
Right.
and then can, start pulling them more into the actual history.
Right.
Like if you read a fun book about Abe Lincoln doing crazy stuff, it might actually get you interested in Abe Lincoln. Right. And then you can use critical literacy to, we all have some ideas of Abe Lincoln. but where were those books written from?
Right.
Right. You know, he wasn't all perfect.
Who wrote those stories?
Who wrote
That goes
those
back
stories?
to
It
it.
goes
Who
back
is
to
it written
critical
for?
literacy, right?
Right.
Who was it written for? Who was it written by? And what details? I think it's also important to mention, you know, Abe Lincoln's a great idea. When you're reading a book about how great he was, what details is that author choosing to leave out to get their message across?
Yep.
You know, we all think of Abe Lincoln freeing the slaves as, you know, great. He was awesome. And, you know, that's, you know, one of the most pivotal moments in American history, right?
Right.
But was it truly just his good intentions, or did he have political motives behind doing that? You know, but a lot of the texts we read, if we're not critical of them, we never get to that deeper story.
Right.
So I think Abe Lincoln, if you're looking to explore critical literacy, start with books about Abe Lincoln and learn, you know, what really was driving all of these factors. And, you know, again, it's the most important decision that was ever made in American history.
Is that why we have conspiracy theories?
I do love a good conspiracy theory, but no, it's just great to see. And it's easy when he was the victor. It comes back to history's written by the victor.
Right.
You get books about how great he was, and it was his decision to free slaves, but they never talk about other political factors and the other people around him that drove this decision.
Right.
So that's like, if you're wanting to get into critical literacy as an adult, you know, American history is a great place to start doing that.
Well, I think this is going to conclude our first podcast. I hope my professor enjoyed our conversation as much as I did. So, Ryan, I want to thank you for being on the podcast today. And for my professor, Dr. Miller, I will make sure that the references are linked in Brightspace for you when I upload this. And I do want to thank you for this wonderful class, because I learned so much, and I truly was excited about this content, because I think I was able to make connections between what I'm learning at Brockport and what my practice is in the classroom. So again, I want to thank Ryan for being on the podcast today, but I also want to thank you for allowing me to grow in my practice and learn about critical literacy in a more deeper way. So thank you. Hope you enjoy it.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.